prophets, or San Shyuum, have always been presented as these scheming and manipulative liars, with the high prophet of truth being the epitome of these traits. But is it possible that this high prophet was something else? A backstabber? Hello everybody, and welcome. My name is Jackson Ebsage, and today I want to talk about the prophet of truth, and how he may have impacted the deaths of both Regret and Mercy in Halo 2, as well as why I believe his descent into madness in Halo 3 is a lot more reasonable than you probably imagine. First, some context. During the very outset of the Human Covenant War, these three San Shyuum, who would go on to become the high prophets of truth, mercy, and regret, were informed by a fragment of the ancient Forerunner AI, mendicant bias, on the true nature of their beliefs. Aboard the Anodyne Spirit, which is the ship that sits in the uppermost portion of High Charity's dome, the trio learned that the Great Journey was in fact false, and that the humans were the rightful protectors of the galaxy. Understanding that this revelation would bring ruin to the entire Covenant Empire, they promised to never let this secret out. With that information in hand, the three blackmailed, schemed, and plotted their ways to the title of High Prophet, which is the zenith of power within the Covenant's hegemony. Despite the fact that all three of them had the power to destroy the Covenant at any given moment, the High Prophet of Truth was almost always their ringleader and ultimate decision-maker. But why do I say that Truth allowed Mercy and Regret to die? Let's go chronologically and start with Regret. As the Battle of Earth begins, the Prophet of Regret finds himself outnumbered and outgunned, fleeing to Delta Halo, with the UNSC's In Amber clad not far behind. The human forces land on the ring in pursuit of Regret, ultimately culminating with the Chief beating him to death. Immediately after exiting the temple where their fight takes place, Chief encounters a Covenant carrier low in the sky preparing to glass the lake, leading to his encounter with the Gravemind. Jump to the cutscene at the beginning of the level Sacred Icon, where we see the Arbiter going to meet with Truth and Mercy in the midst of the changing of the guard. Here we interrupt the tail end of a conversation between then Spec Ops Commander Artes Vadum and the remaining High Prophets. They're arguing over a decision made by Truth where he withdrew a number of Artes's phantoms that were going to secure Regret's temple.
This is unprecedented. Unacceptable.
The Hierarch is dead, Commander.
His murderer was within our grasp. If you had not withdrawn our phantoms...
Are you questioning my decision?
No, Holy One. I only wish to express my concern that the brutes...
Recommissioning the Guard was a radical step. But recent events have made it abundantly clear that the elites can no longer guarantee our safety.
I shall relay your decision to the Council.
First off, withdrawing the Phantoms was obviously done as a way to put the brutes in power, serving as an example for why the elites were unfit to hold the military roles they historically held now that they'd allowed a High Prophet to die. I'd propose that this also worked as an oh-so-convenient way for Truth to begin dismantling his checks and balances. With half of his major political opposition gone, and the unwavering loyalty of the brutes replacing the critical thinking of the elites, he was well on his way to being the single de facto ruler of the entire Covenant Empire. But what about Mercy? First, let's take a look back on the circumstances surrounding his death. Throughout the mission Gravemind, we pursue Truth, Mercy, their brute escort, and their human captives throughout the upper districts of High Charity. About halfway through the level, the In Amber clad once again appears, this time above the city, before it crashes into a far-off structure. Moments later, we hear intercepted reports claiming flutter spewing out of the burning and mauled ship. By mission's end, we've just about caught up to the Prophets and their group. Right as they're preparing to leave the city, a swarm of flood infection forms crawls onto the landing pad. Tartarus and his brutes splatter nearly all of them, but one squeezes past them and books it to Mercy. In the brief half a second where we see the creature jump, there's something a little more interesting going on. If you watch the scene again and pay attention to Mercy, you can see that he is frantically mashing the arm on his throne. Thanks to our encounter with Regret, and a panel from the comic book series Halo Uprising, we know that the thrones of the High Prophets have a number of interesting different gadgets. These include the ability to charge and fire a plasma beam, short-range teleportation, a personal shield, and possibly more. I believe that Mercy mashing the arm on his chair is him actually attempting to activate one of these defensive measures, but that obviously never happens. But why wouldn't his chair work? I think the most likely case is probably sabotage by Truth, but how would that even happen? So, I can really only speculate on this, but I imagine Truth might send a loyal brute or maybe even a loyal San Shyuum that he bribed or blackmailed to futz with Mercy's throne while he was away from it. Of course, Truth didn't know the Flood would attack when they did, but he had the chair disabled, so if at any time they were threatened by anyone, Mercy would effectively be dead in the water and totally helpless, leaving Truth to be the sole political power of the Covenant. Whether or not you believe Truth played a part in the deaths of Regret and Mercy, or if you think it's just a series of coincidences, let's switch gears for a bit and move on to Truth's madness in Halo 3. Making his Halo 3 debut in the game's second level, Truth appears on the monitors throughout the UNSC's jungle base, Crow's Nest. In a feverish sweat, he delivers a ranting monologue, presenting himself with none of the charm that he was associated with in Halo 2, coming off as more of a madman than anything else. Ever since this mission, Truth's Halo 3 appearance has been called one of the only bad aspects of the entire game. Despite poor public reception, I think his manic state is pretty easy to explain, and I think it's also a reasonable progression from the character we had in Halo 2. First, though, I think there's an elephant in the room that needs to be addressed: his voice actors. To both public and critical acclaim, Michael Wincott famously portrayed Truth as suave and cunning in Halo 2. He did not, however, reprise his role in Halo 3, with a man named Terrence Stamp voicing Truth instead. Personally, I think they both did really well, and I believe that if Mr. Wincott had voiced Truth in Halo 3, the character wouldn't have received nearly as much flack as he did. That being said, I want to discuss why Truth being senile and just downright insane in Halo 3 actually makes a fair bit of sense. Throughout much of Halo 2, Truth is setting the stage for the Brute's usurpation of the elites. He needs to keep this enormous shift a secret from anybody who could leak his plans, which is practically everyone. It's important to know that Truth isn't just making the shift from elites to brutes solely because the Sanghila were becoming a tad suspicious. This replacement gives Truth a colossal amount of power. The majority of Gerald Hanai are brawn over brains, and by the 2550s, all the brutes in the Covenant have absolute faith in Truth and the Great Journey. With the brutes in power and the elites out, the Covenant is pretty much Truth's own private empire. His only source of opposition could maybe be another High Prophet, of which there aren't any, or perhaps another chieftain of the brutes, but at this time, that's a role left unoccupied, since Tartarus was sliced open by Arbiter in Halo 2. Now that we understand his motivation for letting Regret and Mercy die, as well as the source of his apparent insanity, there's one big question that remains. Why would he still attempt to fire the Halo rings from the Ark? As far as I know, we have little to no hard evidence for why Truth attempted to fire the Halo ray, so everything I'm saying has a heavy amount of speculation and is inferred from what we know about Truth at the point he makes that decision. There are three possible explanations that I think are reasonable, but I first need to explain why he couldn't stop if he really, really wanted to. Had Truth announced that the Great Journey was false, he would have probably literally been torn apart by all ranks of the Covenant. I would, however, be interested to see how the brutes responded. They did have total faith in the Great Journey, but at this time they also had probably total faith in Truth, seeing him as, well, a prophet. So it'd be interesting to see how he might try to weasel his way out of that one. Humanity and her allies also wouldn't let this happen. The human population, and maybe even the separatist Covenant forces, would want a total destruction of their enemy. Large groups like the Office of Naval Intelligence would want the Covenant totally gone. I mean, they still do. And smaller groups and individuals like the Silent Shadow or Artas of Adum, now a shipmaster, had their own scores to settle and weren't going to let their targets get away. That being said, the first possible reason for why Truth activated the array is that he just recognized he was in too deep. I mean, there was no way he could back out now, so he continued along with this enormous amount of power for as long as he could. Time, of course, eventually ran out, and, still attempting to maintain some power, had no choice other than to activate the array from the Ark, only to be foiled by the Chief and the Arbiter. For my second theory, I'd propose that Truth may have just been so genuinely, actually, honest-to-God insane that he thought the Great Journey was in some way true. Whether he never really believed what Mendicant Bias told him, or he developed some mistrust over the 3 decades since their encounter, he eventually became so crazy that he thought the Great Journey, the message of which was probably told to him dozens of times each day, got the better of him, and he became a true believer, so to speak. Finally, I think it's possible that he was so desperate to believe that he tried to convince himself. Whether this was because he couldn't fathom everything he knew was built on a lie, or he felt he needed to justify how he'd now waged a 30-year war that cost billions of lives, it seems maybe the only way he felt he could go down was with his eyes closed. Whether or not you believe that Truth did in fact have a hand in the killings of both Regret and Mercy, or if you think his character from Halo 3 is or isn't a reasonable progression from his representation in Halo 2, thank you so much for watching this video. I'm not really sure when my next video is going to be out, don't really have a schedule as of the moment, and I'm still learning the basics of editing, recording, writing scripts, that sort of thing. I just have a huge number of ideas that I'm passionate about and I want to see through. So, we'll see what the future holds. See you next time.